On my 33rd birthday, my mother leaned across the table and whispered to my father, telling him to have my brother go change the locks on my apartment immediately. Smirking, my brother stood up and strolled out of the high-end French restaurant. An hour later, he returned, pale as a ghost. He leaned over to my parents and whispered, his voice trembling, that he couldn't even get past the armed private security officers guarding the lobby. What he didn't know was that I had been sitting there the whole time, calmly sipping a glass of Cabernet Sauvignon, waiting for his entire world to crumble. My name is Jocelyn. I'm 33, and I work in Boston as an estate liquidator and senior art appraiser. My job is to evaluate the estates of the deceased and pull priceless treasures out of absolute junk. It's a specialized field that requires a sharp eye, deep historical knowledge, and an obsession with detail. Ironically, my own family always viewed my career as nothing more than glorified junk collecting. Growing up in a typical old-money Boston family meant everyone was assigned a strict role. Mine was to be the embarrassing disappointment. My mother, Beatrice, is obsessed with social standing and class. She owns a luxury fashion and art boutique on the ground floor of a historic downtown building, maintaining her status with religious devotion. My father, Richard, is a managing director at Apex Financial, a top private equity firm. A cold-hearted Wall Street figure who measures human worth purely by annual income and portfolio size. Then there's my perfect brother, Preston. He works under my father with a shiny corporate title that exists solely to mask the fact that he's utterly incompetent. And finally, my sister-in-law, Simone, a fiercely successful, sharp-tongued woman who carved out a place for herself in the cutthroat luxury real estate market. She married Preston 3 years ago, convinced she was securing a ticket to generational wealth. She and my mother bonded instantly over their love for designer brands and their mutual disdain for me. Tonight was supposed to be a dinner celebrating my 33rd birthday. We were sitting in an exclusive, members-only French restaurant downtown under sparkling crystal chandeliers, reading menus that didn't even list prices. But I knew better than to expect a genuine celebration. In my family, dinners were never about affection. They were staged events for my mother to exert control. As soon as the main course was cleared, Beatrice gestured to the waiter to bring over my gift. I watched as the waiter awkwardly carried over a large, flat package wrapped in cheap silver ribbon and placed it on the empty chair beside me. I pulled off the ribbon and tore away the paper. Inside was a stack of flattened, heavy-duty moving boxes. I looked up across the table. Beatrice took a delicate sip of sparkling water, a practiced, condescending smile playing on her lips. "Happy birthday, Jocelyn," she announced loudly enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "You're 33 now. It's time to grow up and move out of that apartment. You have until tomorrow afternoon to pack your things and leave." I didn't cry. I didn't react at all. I simply folded my hands in my lap and waited for her to finish her speech. "Preston and Simone are expanding their property staging business," Beatrice continued, gesturing toward my brother and sister-in-law. "They need a secure, centralized location to store Simone's imported Italian furniture for her high-end listings. Your apartment is the perfect size. Frankly, you've overstayed your welcome there anyway." Simone leaned forward, resting her elbows on the immaculate white tablecloth. The diamonds on her wrist caught the ambient lighting, flashing sharply. "Let's be realistic, Jocelyn," Simone said in a dismissive corporate tone. "I know you make a living digging through dusty leftovers from the deceased, but the lease on that penthouse was signed 5 years ago under your mother's name. Legally, you don't own anything. We need that space for our inventory. With your income, you can easily find a cheap studio further out in the suburbs. That's much more suited to your station." The level of absurdity was breathtaking. It was true that 5 years ago, when I was 28 and just starting my appraisal company, Beatrice signed as a co-signer on the lease for the penthouse in Boston's financial district. Over the years, she never let me forget it, using it like a leash whenever she felt I was becoming too independent. What Simone, Preston, and my parents didn't know was that the situation regarding that building had completely changed. Over the past 5 years, I had quietly built an extensive network of elite art collectors, earning substantial commissions from multi-million-dollar estate liquidations. I didn't just have enough money to pay rent. I had accumulated enough capital to change the rules of the game entirely. Still, I kept my face completely blank. I looked over at my father, who was focused on cutting his cheesecake. He didn't even look up, having no intention of saying a word in my defense. He had spent his life favoring Preston, ensuring his golden boy had every advantage while treating my existence as a slight inconvenience. Then I caught it. The subtle, silent exchange that defined my family's nature. Beatrice leaned slightly toward Richard, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "While everyone is sitting here, tell your son to go change her apartment locks right now. Do it tonight so she can't resist tomorrow." Richard gave a slight nod and nudged Preston under the table. Preston checked his phone and forced an apologetic smile. "I have to take a call from a major client," he said smoothly, standing up and tossing his napkin onto the chair. "Be back in a bit. Happy birthday, little sister." He turned and strolled out of the restaurant, completely unaware that he was walking straight into a concrete wall. A smug silence settled over the table. Beatrice and Simone exchanged a knowing look, clearly thrilled with how quickly and ruthlessly they had set my eviction in motion. They expected me to break down. They expected me to beg for a few more weeks, plead with my father for financial help, or cause a scene so they could later claim I was unstable. Instead, I met the waiter's eye. "Excuse me," I said, my voice calm and steady. "I'd like to order a bottle of your finest vintage Cabernet Sauvignon from the reserve list." My mother frowned, her perfectly manicured brows knitting together in annoyance. "Jocelyn, don't make a scene. On your income, you can't afford a $500 bottle of wine, and I am certainly not paying for it." I smiled, pulled a heavy, matte black metal credit card from my wallet, and set it lightly on the table. "Oh, don't worry, Mom. I'll cover the wine. In fact, I'm taking care of the entire bill tonight. Consider it a celebration of my fresh start." The waiter respectfully took the black card with both hands and stepped away. Beatrice let out a scoff and rolled her eyes at Simone, clearly convinced I was desperately throwing myself into credit card debt, just to save face. Simone let out a quiet, contemptuous laugh and went back to answering work emails on her phone. I leaned back in my chair and gently swirled the ice water in front of me, feeling the cool glass against my fingers. I felt no pressure, nor was I heartbroken by their betrayal. I was simply counting down the minutes. I knew it took exactly 20 minutes for Preston to drive to the downtown apartment building. It would take him 10 minutes to realize in frustration that his master key wouldn't open the newly installed security doors in the lobby. Then, it would take him another 30 minutes to drive back in a total panic. So I sat there, enjoying the comfortable silence and the elegant atmosphere, entirely prepared to watch their world turn upside down. Exactly 62 minutes after he walked out, my brother stumbled back to our table. The arrogant smile he had been wearing earlier was gone. His breathing was heavy and ragged, as if he were on the verge of a panic attack. The collar of his custom suit was soaked with cold sweat, sticking awkwardly to his neck, and his silk tie hung askew. He didn't sit down. He leaned heavily against the edge of the table, clumsily knocking over a crystal water glass. Ice and water spilled across the pristine linen tablecloth, but he didn't even notice the mess he had made. "Mom, there's armed security down there," he gasped out, his eyes darting wildly around the room as if he expected someone to tackle him to the ground at any second. My mother slammed her silver fork onto her plate. Her manicured hands gripped the edge of the table as she glared at her son. "What are you talking about, Preston? I told you to get a locksmith, drill the lock, and throw her cheap furniture into the hallway. Why are you running back here dripping with sweat like a common laborer? Porch. Preston shook his head frantically, wiping a bead of cold sweat from his forehead. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a thick legal property binder, slamming it down next to Beatrice's plate. I couldn't even get into the lobby. Mom, the old concierge is gone. The entire security system for the building was completely torn out and replaced. Porch. They have armed private contractors standing right at the elevators. When I tried to force my way to the top floor, they handed me this. Beatrice snatched the binder, her face flushing red with anger. My father finally looked up from his phone screen, his brow furrowed in genuine irritation. Porch, in his deep, commanding voice, the one he used to intimidate junior analysts at his firm, he demanded to know what was wrong. Preston pointed a trembling finger at the binder. Look at the name on the deed, Dad. It's not a residential rental building anymore. The entire high-rise was rezoned, and it was just purchased as the new corporate headquarters for GW Holdings. Porch. Beatrice let out a sharp, aggressive laugh, roughly flipping through the text of legal documents. Her mind refused to connect the dots. GW Holdings? What does that have to do with this ungrateful girl? She glared venomously across the table at me. Richard, call the property management company right now. Porch. Tell them we are personal friends of the original owner and demand immediate access to my daughter's apartment. This is ridiculous. I picked up the $500 glass of reserve Cabernet and took a slow, deliberate sip. The rich, complex flavor coated my palate, perfectly matching the sensation of absolute victory rushing through my veins. Porch. You can't call property management, Dad, I said smoothly, setting the crystal glass back on the table. Because I let them go on Tuesday. My parents froze instantly. Preston collapsed heavily into the empty chair beside me, staring at me as if I had suddenly grown horns. What did you just say to me? Richard snapped, leaning forward with his hands clenched into fists on the table. Porch. I folded my hands neatly on the table, meeting his angry glare without backing down. I don't just live in the penthouse, Mom. Last week, I bought the entire building through a foreclosure process. Through my LLC, GW Holdings, I spent 5 months aggressively bidding on the property, and the title officially cleared 4 days ago. I am now the sole legal owner of the building. Porch. That's impossible. Beatrice burst out laughing, but her voice was sharp and fragile, exposing her spiraling panic. You make a living appraising old furniture. That building is worth at least $15 million. You couldn't possibly have that kind of money. You're lying just to save face before we kick you out. Porch. Smiling, I pulled a sleek tablet from my bag and tapped the screen a few times before sliding it across the table to her. On the screen was a digital copy of the final federal property deed, clearly displaying my full legal name next to a massive bank wire transfer receipt. I didn't buy the building with money from appraising furniture, Mom. Porch. My starting capital came from restoring and auctioning off the antiques you and Dad threw out as junk from Grandma's estate 10 years ago. Richard's face drained of color, turning a sickening shade of gray. Back then, you said those antiques were space-consuming garbage. You sold them for $200 to a local scrapper, just to buy Preston a new Rolex as a college graduation gift. Porch. A college he dropped out of 3 weeks later, by the way. At the blunt reminder of his failure, Preston flinched and looked away. I continued, keeping my tone completely even, making sure every single word landed with precision. I tracked down every single piece from Grandma's collection. It took me years. Porch. I bought them back from pawn shops and bankruptcy auctions, restored them by hand in my workshop, and had them authenticated by top federal institutions. Last year, a private museum in London purchased the entire restored collection from me for $18 million. I used that cash to buy the building outright. Porch. I looked at their faces, twisted in shock, and said word for word, "To spoil your favorite son, you literally threw away a fortune, and I used that fortune to become your landlord." Beatrice stared at the tablet, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to find words to argue. But the indisputable legal proof was right in front of her. Torch. The color was completely gone from Richard's face. As a Wall Street veteran, he understood the absolute legal authority of the document on the screen better than anyone. But I wasn't finished. The real conflict was just beginning, and I had saved my most decisive card for last. Torch. By the way, Mom, I leaned forward, dropping my voice, so only our table could hear the final nail in the coffin. The commercial lease for your luxury art boutique on the ground floor of my building expired yesterday, at midnight. You were so busy planning how to throw me out on the street that you forgot to check your own legal paperwork. Torch. Since you failed to submit a renewal notice to the new management, which is me, you are now on a month-to-month tenancy. Your rent has just increased by 400%. You have 30 days to pay the new rate, or my security detail will personally clear your inventory out of the space. A suffocating silence followed my announcement. Torch. I could hear the faint jazz playing from the restaurant speakers and the quiet clatter of silverware from tables across the room. Every diner in our section had stopped eating, their eyes locked on our table. Beatrice stared at me, her mouth agape. The flawless, elegant persona she had spent decades cultivating shattered completely in an instant. Torch. Her face went from sickly pale to a deep, furious crimson. She stood up so abruptly that her heavy wooden chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor, sounding like a gunshot. "You ungrateful thief!" she screeched, her voice trembling with a rage I had never seen her display publicly. "You stole that money! A glorified pawnshop worker could never legally acquire $18 million. Torch. You hacked into your father's private equity accounts. You misappropriated family funds to buy that building just to get back at us." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I took another slow sip of my wine, savoring the rich flavor before setting the glass down. Every single cent of that money was earned by me, Mom. I simply recognized the true value of what this family threw away. Torch. It's not my fault you were too foolish to recognize museum-quality artifacts sitting right in your living room. Richard slammed his hand onto the table, making the crystal glasses rattle loudly. "Sit down, Beatrice," he commanded, his voice dropping to a dangerously low pitch. He turned his cold, calculating gaze onto me. He wasn't a man who yelled. Torch. He was used to destroying people quietly, leveraging his massive financial influence to crush anyone who stepped out of line. "You think you've won, Jocelyn?" Richard said, leaning forward until his face was inches from mine. "You think buying a commercial property makes you untouchable? You're nothing more than a lucky appraiser who got fortunate on one deal." Torch. "Tomorrow morning, all it takes is 5 phone calls to members of my board. I'll tell them you're under investigation for fraud. I will have your appraisal license flagged, your company blacklisted across the entire East Coast, and every major auction house will refuse your calls. By the end of the week, I will see you completely ruined." Torch. I looked at him, feeling a deep sense of pity mixed with absolute satisfaction. "Your tactics are getting old, Dad. You used that exact same playbook 5 years ago." He paused, clearly caught off guard by my completely calm reaction. "Did you really think I forgot?" I continued in a conversational tone. "Torch. When I was 28 and refused to abandon my career to become Preston's personal assistant, you called every country club member you knew. You told them I was unstable and warned them against hiring my firm for estate liquidations. You tried to starve me out of the industry, so I'd come crawling back to work for your precious son." I let out a cold laugh. "Torch. But when I generated 3 times the expected returns on their asset sales, your wealthy friends didn't care about your petty family drama. Your threats didn't work when I was operating out of a rented garage. Now that I own the most coveted commercial high-rise in the financial district, your threats are nothing more than a joke." Torch. Preston sank even lower into his chair, looking like a trapped animal. He was practically hyperventilating. his eyes darting frantically between me and the digital deed on the tablet. He knew I had completely defeated him. Simone, however, was a different story. My sister-in-law sat there like a stone statue, her dark eyes tracking every movement, every word. Torch. As a powerful woman who had fought her way to the top of the luxury real estate market, she recognized checkmate when she saw it. She didn't jump in to defend her husband or my parents. Torch. Her mind was clearly racing, calculating the catastrophic financial damage this massive rent increase would inflict on her own property staging business. A business that relied heavily on my mother's gallery space for cross-promotion. Simone was a realist, and right now she was realizing she had backed the wrong horse in this family. Torch. Seeing that his intimidation tactics were failing, Richard clenched his jaw tightly, a vein pulsing visibly at his temple. He was a tyrant accustomed to absolute obedience, and my defiance was pushing him to the edge of his composure. "Fine," he sneered, pulling a smartphone from his suit jacket pocket. "If you want to play dirty, we'll do this the hardest way possible." Torch. "You've committed federal wire fraud, Jocelyn. You stole $18 million from my private equity firm to purchase this property, and I'm calling the police right now." Right there at the dinner table, he unlocked his phone and dialed 911. Beatrice gasped, a look of triumphant vengeance rushing back onto her face. "Yes, Richard. Tell them to send officers immediately." Torch. "We'll have her arrested before dessert is served." I watched with quiet amusement as my father held the phone to his ear. "Yes, my name is Richard, managing director at Apex Financial. I need to report a major case of corporate embezzlement and wire fraud. My daughter stole $18 million from my firm's holding accounts to purchase commercial real estate." He paused. Torch. "Yes, the suspect is sitting right in front of me at the Belmont restaurant on 5th Avenue. Send officers immediately. She is a flight risk." He hung up, tossed the phone onto the table, and crossed his arms. His smile was purely predatory. "The police will be here in 5 minutes, Jocelyn. Enjoy your wine. It might be the last good vintage you taste before you're sitting in a holding cell." Torch. "When you're standing before a judge facing 20 years for federal wire fraud, maybe you'll finally learn your place in this family." Preston wiped his sweaty forehead with a linen napkin and let out a long breath, attempting to regain a bit of his earlier bravado. "You brought this on yourself," he muttered. "All you had to do was listen to Mom, pack your boxes, and leave." Torch. I didn't break eye contact with my father. I reached out, picked up my glass, and took another slow, deliberate sip. The absolute certainty in his eyes was almost comical. He truly believed his wealth and status allowed him to rewrite reality at will. He thought all he had to do was snap his fingers, accuse me of a felony, and the world would bend to his command. Torch. I set the glass down, picked up the tablet, and slid it back into my leather bag. "I look forward to speaking with the officers, Dad," I said calmly. "I have federal certificates of sale from the auction, wire receipts from the London Museum, and fully legitimate title documentation verified by the IRS right here." I stood up, looking down at him. "Torch. However, since you just made a false police report in front of a dozen witnesses, accusing me of a federal felony, my legal team will be more than happy to file suit against you tomorrow morning for defamation and harassment, seeking substantial damages." In the distance, the wail of sirens pierced through the ambient noise of the city streets outside. Torch. I stood there completely relaxed, watching the flashing red and blue lights begin to reflect off the restaurant's front windows. The heavy glass doors swung open, and 4 uniformed Boston police officers strode into the dining area. The quiet chatter among the wealthy patrons vanished instantly into total silence. Richard stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a practiced air of authority. Torch. He immediately walked toward the lead officer, extending a hand as if welcoming them to a corporate board meeting. "Officer, I'm Richard, managing director at Apex Financial. I made the call." He pointed a rigid finger straight at my face. "This woman is my daughter, but she has committed serious financial crimes. She embezzled $18 million from my firm to buy commercial property. Torch. I want her handcuffed immediately before she attempts to move the funds offshore. Beatrice crossed her arms, a smug, venomous smile spreading across her face. Preston squared his shoulders, suddenly finding his courage again with the arrival of the police. Only Simone remained seated, her dark eyes narrowed as she stared intently at my hands. Torch. She was the only one smart enough to realize that my behavior wasn't that of a trapped criminal. The lead officer kept his hand near his belt as he walked up to the table. "Ma'am, I need you to step forward and show me your identification." I didn't argue. I calmly pulled out my driver's license and handed it to him. Then, I unzipped the main compartment of my leather bag. Torch. "I'm fully prepared to cooperate, officer. However, my father is lying to you. I haven't stolen a single cent from his firm, and I have complete federal documentation right here to prove it." I pulled out a thick bound binder. This wasn't just a tablet screen. These were original paper documents, complete with raised notary stamps and official seals. Torch. I laid them out one by one across the white tablecloth. Here is the bill of sale from the London Museum, confirming an $18 million wire transfer directly into my business account. Here is the clearance letter from the IRS, proving all capital gains taxes were paid in full. And here is the clean title deed for the building, registered under my LLC. I met the officer's eyes. Torch. My father has no legal connection to my business or my funds whatsoever. Richard let out a loud sneer, attempting to dismiss the paperwork as fake. That's an obvious forgery. She's just a low-level junk appraiser. There's no way she could get federal clearance for a deal of this size. Arrest her immediately. The officer ignored Richard completely. Torch. He examined the raised seals, the federal letterheads, and the bank routing confirmation codes with great care. The atmosphere at the table was suffocatingly tense. Beatrice kept glancing back and forth between the officer and my father, eagerly waiting for the handcuffs to come out. Instead, the officer closed the binder and handed it back to me with a respectful nod. Torch. Everything here appears completely legitimate and federally certified, the officer said. He turned to my father, his tone shifting instantly from polite to stern. Sir, this is a fully documented, legal transaction. There is zero evidence of embezzlement. If you have a dispute over property ownership, that is a civil matter. Torch. But if you misuse emergency services again to make a false report of a federal felony, you will be the one leaving here in handcuffs today. The color drained from Richard's face in an instant. This prominent business figure, a man who had spent his entire life using financial leverage to dominate our family, had just been publicly reprimanded by a patrol officer in front of Boston's elite. Torch. He opened his mouth to argue, but no sound came out. He was completely powerless, and the realization hit him like a physical blow. Beatrice gasped, clutching the pearl necklace around her neck tightly. This has to be a mistake. She can't own that building. My boutique is in that building. Which brings me to the final item I need to address tonight, I added smoothly. Torch. I reached into my bag one last time and pulled out a heavy cardstock document. I slid it across the table until it rested right in front of Beatrice's plate. What is this? Beatrice demanded, glaring at the paper as if it were poison. That is your official 30-day notice to vacate, I replied. Torch. Since your lease expired yesterday and you clearly have no intention of paying the 400% rent increase, you are formally required to surrender the ground floor retail space. I expect your boutique to be completely cleared out by the end of the month. If a single display rack is left behind, my security team will clear it directly into the disposal bins. Torch. Preston looked like he was about to throw up. Simone finally shifted her gaze away from me to stare intently at the eviction notice, her mind rapidly assessing the financial loss her own business was about to take, tied as it was to my mother's gallery. I stood up and smoothed the folds of my dress. The police officers were already heading back toward the exit. Torch. The entire restaurant remained deathly quiet, as everyone witnessed the collapse of my family's inner dynamic. I looked at my parents, feeling a profound sense of finality. "You spent my entire life treating me like a burden," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the room. "You called my profession a joke. You threw away Grandma's treasures just to buy Preston a watch. And tonight, you tried to throw me out on the street just to clear space for a few imported sofas." I paused, looking at each of them one last time before turning away. "But you missed the single most critical detail. I'm the one who actually knows how to evaluate value. I know exactly what things are worth, and I know precisely what all of you are worth." I looked at them coldly. "You are all completely worthless." I picked up my purse, turned around, and walked out of the restaurant. The cool night air was immensely refreshing. I had won this battle, but I knew the fight was far from over. The next morning, I was sitting behind a massive mahogany desk in my new penthouse office. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Boston skyline stretched out in a breathtaking view. I was reviewing the building's new security protocols when the heavy oak door to my office was kicked wide open. Simone barged in. My sister-in-law was wearing a sharp, deep red designer suit, her high heels clicking aggressively against the hardwood floor. She was a powerful real estate broker, and she definitely wasn't here out of loyalty to Preston. She was out for blood. This commercial building I had just bought was the exact property Simone had spent months desperately trying to acquire to save her struggling firm. She strode up to my desk and slammed a small silver flash drive onto the polished wood. "You think you're so smart, don't you, Jocelyn?" Simone said, her voice dripping with venom. "But I know your idiot brother is buried under mountains of serious gambling debt, and I know how he got the money. You're going to sign over 50% of this building to me right now. If you refuse, I'm mailing this drive straight to the IRS. There's enough on here to prove your father's illicit tax evasion and money laundering schemes through Apex Financial. Give me the building, or I destroy your father." I looked down at the silver flash drive sitting on the mahogany desk, then raised my eyes to meet Simone's angry glare. She stood there with her arms crossed, completely convinced I was going to break. She genuinely believed that threatening me with an IRS exposure on my father's illegal tax schemes would force me to hand over half of a $15 million property. She thought I was just like my parents, willing to do anything to protect the so-called family name. I picked up the flash drive, feeling the cold metal in my palm, and tossed it right back across the desk. It landed on her expensive leather handbag with a sharp click. "I won't give you even 1% of my building, Simone," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "If you want to walk into the federal tax office and hand them the evidence of Richard's financial crimes yourself, be my guest." I watched the shock wash over her face and continued. "But let's be very clear about what happens next. If you report his tax evasion, federal authorities will immediately freeze every single asset associated with Apex Financial. That includes Preston's trust fund, Preston's bank accounts, and of course, your luxury property staging business that was built using their dirty money." I let out a quiet laugh. "You won't just send my father to prison, you'll burn down your own lavish lifestyle with your own hands. Go right ahead, Simone. Let's see who falls first." Simone stared at me, her jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles in her cheek twitching. She knew I was right. She was a ruthless real estate agent, but she wasn't on a suicide mission. Exposing the family meant exposing herself. She snatched the flash drive off the desk, her manicured nails trembling with rage. "You're making a massive mistake, Jocelyn," she hissed, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You think buying a commercial building means you hold all the cards, but your father will never tolerate this level of disrespect. You have no idea what they're planning." She spun on her heel and stormed out of my office, the heavy oak door slamming shut behind her, echoing through the entire penthouse suite. I took a deep breath and turned back to my computer monitor. I had a building to manage, tenants to evaluate, and a multi-million-dollar appraisal firm to run. But Simone's parting words lingered in the air. Porch. I knew my father, Richard, was not a man who accepted defeat. His entire career was built on crushing his opponents, and he had always viewed his own children as nothing more than corporate assets. I knew retaliation was coming, but I severely underestimated just how fast he would move. The storm hit a mere 3 hours later. Porch. I was reviewing a restoration contract for a 17th-century French tapestry when my desk phone rang. It was David, my lead manager at our climate-controlled restoration warehouse in the city. David was a steady, reliable man who rarely panicked. But today, over the hum of the industrial dehumidifiers in the background, his voice sounded frantic. "Jocelyn, we have a major problem," David said. "Porch. The automatic payroll processing just bounced. Every single employee's paycheck was rejected by the bank for insufficient funds. It's not just payroll either. The independent contractors transporting our high-value artifacts just tried to use the company credit cards at the gas station, and they were declined. Porch. They're furious and threatening to pull the transport trucks over and strike if they aren't paid by the end of the day." My blood ran cold. "That's impossible, David. I just transferred $500,000 into the operating account yesterday afternoon, specifically for payroll and logistics. Let me check the banking portal right now." Porch. I immediately logged into the company's secure banking system. As soon as the screen loaded, a massive red banner flashed across the top of my dashboard. SS, dented. Account restricted due to suspicious fraudulent activity. I grabbed my cell phone and dialed my private bank representative. When he finally picked up, his voice was shaky and evasive. Porch. He apologized profusely before explaining that a top-level security alert had been triggered across my entire portfolio. A senior director from Apex Financial had personally contacted the bank's fraud department, accusing me of international money laundering linked to the $18 million wire transfer I received from London. My father, Richard. Porch. He had used his massive institutional influence and deep connections in the banking industry to illegally freeze all of my operating accounts. He knew he couldn't legally take my building away, so he chose to choke off my cash flow instead. He wanted to starve my company to death. In the world of high-end antiques and estate liquidations, reputation is everything. Porch. If my contractors went on strike and my employees weren't paid, my business would completely paralyze. Millions of dollars in artifacts would lose security, and my clients would panic. Richard was trying to engineer a total operational collapse, backing me into a corner so I'd have no choice but to sell the building back to him just to survive. Porch. I told David to calm the contractors down and guaranteed I would have the problem resolved within an hour. Hanging up the phone, I felt the heavy weight of my father's financial warfare pressing down on me. Just then, my phone buzzed on the desk. A text message popped up from my brother Preston. Porch. I opened it to find a photo. Preston lounging in a private booth at an exclusive downtown club, holding a glass of expensive champagne with his signature arrogant smirk. Below the photo was a mocking caption. "Dad sends his regards. Rent might be due, but looks like your pockets are suddenly empty. Have fun explaining to your staff why they're working for free. Porch. See you in the gutter, little sister." They thought they had won. They thought they had finally backed the black sheep of the family into a dead end. My father genuinely believed his influence in the banking system made him an untouchable god, assuming all my financial lifelines were tied to the accounts he had just frozen. I set my phone face down on the desk. I didn't cry, and I didn't panic. Porch. Instead, a slow, cold smile spread across my face. I stood up from my desk and walked over to the massive oil painting hanging on the far wall of my office. Reaching behind the heavy gilded frame, I triggered a hidden biometric scanner. A concealed wall safe popped open with a soft click. Porch. Inside the steel vault were various confidential documents, but I bypassed them and reached for a small, encrypted burner phone. I powered on the device and waited for the secure network connection to establish. My father thought he was the only person in this family who knew how to move money around. He was about to learn a very painful lesson about the reality of true wealth. I dialed an unlisted international direct line to Switzerland. It rang twice before a crisp professional voice with a slight accent answered. Zurich Central Operations. Please state your authorization code. I recited the complex alphanumeric sequence, flawlessly, feeling a satisfying rush of absolute control. The voice on the other end confirmed my identity immediately. Good afternoon, ma'am. How may we assist you today? I looked out the window at the city spreading below me, knowing my family was currently celebrating my downfall. It's time to execute the contingency plan, I said calmly. Liquidate the offshore trust and route the emergency operating funds through secondary channels in the Cayman Islands. I need $5 million in clean, untraceable cash resting safely in my corporate account before the close of business today. By 5 that afternoon, $5 million routed seamlessly through the Cayman channels, landing safely in my newly established corporate account. I immediately authorized all payroll disbursements and issued an extra 20% bonus to every independent contractor who had waited patiently. My company was secure, and my father's attempt to strangle me financially had completely failed. But I knew the moment Richard checked his banking monitors and realized my operations were running flawlessly, his shock would instantly turn into scorched earth tactics. I didn't have to wait long to see their next move. The following morning, I walked into my penthouse office, carrying a cup of freshly brewed coffee, ready to review new tenant applications. My executive assistant, Clara, was already waiting by my desk. Without a word, she slid a brand new copy of Boston Elite, the city's most widely read high society's magazine, across the polished wood. On the cover was a professionally staged, heartbreaking photo of Beatrice and Preston. My mother was clutching a silk handkerchief, playing the role of a devastated family matriarch, while my brother stood behind her, offering a comforting hand on her shoulder. The headline read in bold letters, "A family torn apart by greed." I picked up the magazine and read the exclusive interview. Beatrice and Preston had fed the media a meticulously crafted script. They painted me as a deeply unstable, money-hungry daughter who had taken advantage of my grandmother's severe dementia in her final years. According to their completely fabricated story, I had manipulated an elderly woman suffering from severe Alzheimer's, secretly coaxing her into handing over the family's most cherished heirlooms. They claimed I was a rogue appraiser with no moral boundaries, stealing from my own relatives to fuel a reckless spending spree. Beatrice had even added a quote in the interview. "I pray every night for Jocelyn's mental recovery." It was a precisely calculated, devastating public relations hit. In the world of high-end antiques and elite estate liquidations, trust and discretion are the only currency that matters. Old money families would never hire an appraiser wrapped in scandal and publicly fighting with their own family. Before I could even put the magazine down, my office phone began ringing off the hook. For the next 2 hours, the calls were non-stop. Clients began pulling contracts, and a curator from a prominent museum canceled a consultation. Then, my private line lit up. It was Mrs. Montgomery, one of the wealthiest widows in the Northeast. I had already signed a contract to appraise her late husband's estate next month, a deal worth over $2 million in commissions alone. "Jocelyn, I am calling to formally terminate our working relationship," Mrs. Montgomery said, her voice dripping with cold judgment. "I read that article this morning. I simply cannot allow someone with your reputation to handle my late husband's private collection." I maintained a strictly professional tone. "Mrs. Montgomery, that article is a complete fabrication, designed by my family in retaliation for a property deal. I have federal documentation proving I acquired those assets legally, I don't care about your documentation, she cut in sharply. I care about character. Your brother, Preston, is such an upright, selfless young man. Orch. The work he did at the Children's Hospital Charity Gala last month was nothing short of impeccable. If a man of his high moral standing says you are a threat to your family's legacy, then I believe him. Please do not contact my office again. The line went dead. I slowly set the receiver back down. The sheer hypocrisy in her words made my blood boil. Orch. Preston's impeccable charitable work was nothing more than a tax write-off fully funded by my father. To the outside world, my brother was a generous philanthropist, but I knew better than anyone what kind of terrible person he actually was. My mind flashed back to the week before my sophomore year of college. I was 19, working double shifts at a diner all summer, saving every dollar in a cash envelope hidden in my bedroom drawer to pay my upcoming tuition. I woke up one morning to find the envelope gone. Preston had stolen every single cent to pay off an aggressive bookie after betting on the wrong horse at the racetrack. When I confronted my father, crying, Richard simply brushed it off, telling me not to make a big deal out of it and refused to discipline his golden boy. I was forced to work 3-night jobs, sleeping barely 3 hours a day, just to avoid dropping out of school. They protected a thief back then, and they were still protecting a thief now. My family was more than willing to destroy my livelihood just to maintain their illusion of being flawless. As I was pulling up the contact information for my defamation lawyer, the heavy oak doors to my office slid open once again. This time, it wasn't Clara. It was a man wearing a cheap suit and holding a thick manila envelope. He bypassed my assistant entirely and walked straight up to my desk. Jocelyn? He asked. Yes, I answered, standing up. You've been served. He dropped the heavy envelope onto my desk, turned around, and walked out without another word. I tore open the seal and slid the thick stack of legal documents onto the desk. Scanning the first page, I originally assumed it would be a civil lawsuit for defamation or a fabricated claim over the building's ownership. But what I read made my heart drop. It was an emergency summons from the state Supreme Court. My father, using his team of high-priced corporate attorneys, hadn't filed a standard lawsuit. Richard and Beatrice had filed for an emergency involuntary medical conservatorship. They officially declared to the court that I was suffering from severe mental instability, episodic paranoia, and financial mania. They attached the magazine article as Exhibit A, along with a statement signed by a private doctor, claiming I posed a danger to myself. They were asking a judge to declare me legally and mentally unfit to manage my own affairs. If the judge granted this conservatorship, Richard would be handed total legal control over my medical decisions, my business accounts, and automatic control over the $15 million building I had just purchased. They weren't just trying to ruin my reputation anymore. They were trying to completely erase my legal existence. The following Tuesday, I walked through the heavy mahogany doors of the state Supreme Court feeling completely composed. My tailored navy suit was my armor. Walking beside me was my attorney, a sharp, unyielding man who had built his entire career on taking down corporate bullies. Across the center aisle sat my family. Beatrice was dabbing her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, playing the tragic mother to perfection. Preston sat rigidly, one leg shaking nervously under the table, while Simone sat motionless, her calculating eyes locked on me. When the preliminary conservatorship hearing began, my father took the witness stand. Richard wore his finest charcoal suit, a practiced expression of paternal agony painted on his face. He spoke softly to the judge, his voice cracking at all the right moments. He told the court that sitting here broke his heart, but he claimed he had no other choice. He testified that my sudden, massive real estate purchase was a textbook manic episode. He painted a picture of an unstable daughter who had recklessly thrown away $18 million during a mental breakdown. He begged the judge to grant him full emergency conservatorship, so he could take control of my assets, sell the building, and save me from my own self-destructive delusions. It was an Oscar-worthy performance. The judge looked sympathetic, nodding along as Richard spun his lies. Then, it was my attorney's turn for cross-examination. My lawyer didn't waste a single second defending my mental health. He didn't call any psychiatrists to the stand. Instead, he smoothly shifted the focus onto Richard's qualifications to serve as a financial conservator. The attorney asked Richard to state his professional qualifications for the record. Richard puffed out his chest, his familiar arrogance returning in an instant. He proudly listed his decades of experience as a director at Apex Financial. He boasted about managing billions in client assets and spoke highly of the flawless family trust vault that held our family's generational wealth. He confidently assured the judge that placing my building under his control was the safest, most financially responsible decision the court could make. My lawyer smiled. He picked up a thick red folder from our table and handed it directly to the judge, then passed a copy to Richard's legal team. I leaned back in my chair, watching the exact moment my father realized he had walked straight into a trap. Over the past 48 hours, I had utilized the same offshore banking channels I used to buy the building. Through those secure lines, I legally traced the source of Preston's debts, uncovering a financial black hole massive enough to collapse their entire world. My attorney turned to the court, his voice echoing clearly off the marble walls. Your Honor, please turn to page 4 of the dossier. That is an unfiltered, certified bank ledger of Mr. Richard's primary family trust vault. That vault is completely empty. A collective gasp echoed through the gallery. Beatrice stopped dabbing her fake tears, staring at her husband in horror. Preston's face turned as pale as chalk. My lawyer continued listing the indisputable paper trail. Richard hadn't just been enabling his son's gambling addiction. Over the past 3 years, the money Preston lost at high-stakes tables and illegal sports betting had reached catastrophic levels. To keep aggressive loan sharks away from his golden boy, Richard had quietly drained the family trust. When that money ran out, Richard did something even more desperate. He started draining his own private equity clients' accounts. Richard was running a massive, illegal Ponzi scheme inside Apex Financial, solely to cover Preston's gambling losses. The documents proved he had been embezzling millions from elite investors, routing cash through shadow accounts to pay off criminal syndicates. The only reason Richard had filed this desperate medical conservatorship petition was because his firm's federal auditors were closing in on the missing funds. He needed to seize my $15 million building immediately, liquidate it, and use the cash to plug the massive hole in his company's books before federal fraud charges were brought against him. Total chaos erupted inside the courtroom. Richard gripped the edge of the witness stand, his face dripping with cold sweat. His own attorneys stared at the documents in utter shock, realizing their client had just committed perjury while handing them ironclad proof of massive financial crimes. The judge was furious. With an expression of pure disgust, he slammed his gavel down, demanding order. He looked directly at Richard and declared sternly, "This court will not be used as a tool for corporate cover-ups and family theft." The judge dismissed the conservatorship petition on the spot. Before adjourning, he strongly advised Richard to hire a criminal defense attorney immediately, as the court would be submitting these unredacted financial ledgers directly to federal authorities. I stood up, adjusted my jacket, and calmly walked out of the courtroom. Out in the grand marble hallway, my family was in the middle of a total breakdown. Beatrice was leaning against the wall, hyperventilating, clutching her chest, while Richard frantically dialed his crisis PR team, his hands shaking so violently he dropped his phone twice. But the real explosion happened just a few feet away. Simone had backed Preston up against a heavy stone pillar, The polished, untouchable exterior of the powerful real estate broker was completely gone. Her dark eyes were filled with terror, rage, and a terrifying realization. She had fought tooth and nail to climb the social ladder, marrying into a dynasty she truly believed was an elite billionaire family. The only reason she had put up with my family's arrogance was for the financial security they provided. And now, standing outside the courtroom, the ugly truth finally hit her. There was no family fortune. There were no generational assets. Simone realized she was legally bound to a penniless, gambling-addicted criminal whose family was facing decades in federal prison. The absolute disaster in the courtroom should have forced my family to hide away quietly. Any rational person facing a federal investigation for a massive financial fraud scheme would have contacted a defense attorney and kept a low profile. But my mother, Beatrice, was not a rational person. She was a narcissist, driven entirely by public perception. To her, reality was simply whatever people believed. If high society thought she was still a billionaire matriarch, then in her mind she was. Just 2 days after the judge turned my father's bank ledgers over to federal authorities, Beatrice decided to host the season's most lavish charity gala. She set the location right in her luxury art gallery, the ground floor of the building I had just bought. It was a desperate, transparent social counterattack. She wanted a room full of Boston's elite sipping expensive champagne to project an image of absolute financial invincibility. She believed that as long as she could host a $1 million fundraiser, high society would dismiss the rumors about Richard's drained trust vaults as nothing more than meaningless gossip. To ensure her illusion wasn't shattered, Beatrice went to extreme lengths. She hired a team of armed private security guards to post at every public entrance of the gallery. Handing the security chief a photo of my face, she issued a strict order: bar me from entering the building at all costs. She wanted to stand in my building, drink champagne on my property, and pretend I didn't exist. I sat in my penthouse office, watching the live security monitors. I watched valet attendants park luxury cars along the curb. I saw caterers carrying trays of caviar and truffles through the loading bay. I watched the city's wealthiest, most influential people walk through the front doors, completely unaware that their hostess was married to a man who had likely stolen their retirement funds. To attend a party in a building I owned outright, I didn't need an invitation. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water, adjusted the lapels of my tailored emerald green suit, and picked up my digital master keycard. I bypassed the lobby entirely, taking the private freight elevator down from the penthouse, a secure route accessible only to the owner and emergency maintenance crews. It dropped me off perfectly on the second-floor mezzanine, an indoor balcony overlooking the main gallery floor. Tucked in the shadows, the mezzanine was completely hidden from the private security guards watching the main entrance below. I walked up to the glass railing and looked down at the spectacle. The gallery was packed. Waiters in black ties threaded through the crowd, refilling glasses. Preston lingered near the bar, downing his third glass of whiskey, his eyes scanning the room nervously, like a man waiting for a bomb to drop. Simone stood near a group of prominent real estate developers, forcing a bright smile despite her stiff body language. I knew she was currently working behind the scenes, desperately trying to legally sever her assets from Preston before the federal indictments dropped. Then the background music faded. A spotlight illuminated a small stage set up in the center of the gallery. Beatrice stepped up to the microphone, wearing a sparkling silver evening gown. The crowd quieted down, turning their attention to the hostess. Clutching her silk handkerchief, Beatrice wore an elegant, practiced mask of humility. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she began, her voice echoing through the state-of-the-art sound system. "In times of uncertainty, it is our commitment to the community and our family legacy that keeps us strong. My husband and I have always believed that true wealth is measured by how much we give back." Family loyalty and unwavering integrity are the pillars of this gallery. Tonight, we celebrate those exact values. It was sickening. She stood there preaching about integrity while her husband was hiding in his home office, frantically shredding financial documents to cover up a massive Ponzi scheme. I pulled out my encrypted tablet. When I bought the building, I had my tech team completely rewire the central audio-visual network. Beatrice thought she controlled the gallery, but the master digital projector mounted on the ceiling was hardwired directly into the building's servers. Beatrice pointed toward the massive, 30-foot white wall behind the stage. Please direct your attention to the screen. We have prepared a short presentation highlighting the incredible charitable achievements my son, Preston, has accomplished this year. The gallery lights dimmed, and expectant whispers rippled through the crowd. Beatrice stepped back with a proud, teary-eyed smile, waiting for the video to play. I tapped the screen on my tablet, bypassing the gallery's local computer, and activated the master override. The projector flared to life, casting a blinding beam of light across the room. But there was no heartwarming montage of Preston holding oversized checks for charity, nor was there soft piano music playing through the speakers. Instead, a razor-sharp, high-definition image flashed across that 30-foot wall. It was too massive to look away from, the lettering far too bold to ignore. The crowd went dead silent. The sudden stillness was so absolute you could hear the ice melting in the cocktail glasses. Displayed in bold black letters for all of Boston's high society to see was the court-certified, official 30-day notice to vacate. I had highlighted specific clauses in bright red ink. The document clearly stated that Beatrice's lease had expired. Her rent was being raised 400%, and due to non-payment, she was legally required to surrender the premises and clear out her boutique by the end of the month. At the very bottom of the massive projection, my signature was clearly displayed under the title, Sole Property Owner. Beatrice turned to look at the screen. The color drained from her face instantly, making her look like she was about to faint. The microphone slipped from her hand, crashing onto the wooden stage with a deafening screech of feedback that made several guests cover their ears in pain. The whiskey glass in Preston's hand slipped, shattering against the polished concrete floor. I stepped out of the shadows, leaning over the glass railing of the mezzanine balcony. Illuminated by the glow of the massive eviction notice, I was brought into clear view. Looking down at my mother, I raised my glass of sparkling water, offering a silent, mocking toast to her so-called family legacy. The projected eviction notice bathed the entire gallery in a harsh, cold white light. For 10 suffocating seconds, no one moved. Boston's wealthiest socialites, real estate moguls, and corporate board members froze in place, champagne glasses suspended in midair. Then, the whispering started. What began as a low murmur quickly amplified into a tidal wave of shocked gossip. On stage, Beatrice's face twisted into a mask of pure panic. The elegant, untouchable image she had spent decades cultivating shattered into a million pieces. She pointed a trembling finger up at the mezzanine balcony where I stood. "Security!" Beatrice screeched, her voice cracking painfully through the gallery's sound system. "Get her out of here right now! She is trespassing! Throw her out onto the street!" 2 armed security guards sprinted toward the bottom of the grand staircase, their hands resting on their tactical belts. I didn't move an inch. I simply tapped my tablet one more time, signaling the building's automated access control. The heavy security gates at the top of the staircase slid shut with a loud metallic thud, locking the guards out completely. I looked down at the chaos below, my voice projecting calmly through the master sound system. "Don't bother," I said, my voice echoing over the hushed crowd. "This gala is officially over. As the sole owner of this property, I am terminating this unpermitted event immediately. Everyone has 10 minutes to exit the premises before local law enforcement arrives to clear the building." Panic erupted. The wealthy guests, terrified of being caught in the middle of a public scandal or police sweep, began rushing toward the exits, abandoning their drinks and coats. Simone was the first to act. She didn't say a word to Preston or my mother. She simply turned her back on them, grabbed her designer purse, and blended into the fleeing crowd, permanently severing her ties with the sinking family. Porch. Preston sank onto the stage steps, his head in his hands, completely broken. Beatrice stood alone under the glaring light of the eviction notice, staring up at me with tears of rage streaming down her face. Her boutique was gone, her reputation was destroyed, and her husband was facing federal prosecution. Porch. I looked down at them one last time, feeling no hatred, no anger, only the absolute clarity of justice finally delivered. I turned around and walked back toward my penthouse office, leaving them to face the consequences of their own choices in the dark. I didn't run. I didn't hide. Porch. I simply adjusted the cuffs of my tailored emerald green suit with complete composure and began walking down the stairs. I walked down the wide marble steps slowly, the sharp click of my high heels echoing through the growing chaos in the room. As I reached the final step, the lead security officer blocked my path, his posture stiff. I didn't even pause. Porch. I pulled out a stamped titanium master keycard from my pocket and held it right in front of his face. I am the sole legal owner of this commercial property, I said, staring at the guard, my voice low but carrying absolute authority. My holding company holds the primary contract for your private security firm. Porch. If you lay a single finger on me, I won't just fire your entire team tonight. I will personally ensure your contracting licenses are revoked across the entire state of Massachusetts. Move. The security guard looked at the titanium card, then raised his eyes to look at Beatrice, who was losing her mind on stage. He made the only logical choice of his career. Porch. He lowered his hands, took a step back, and cleared a direct path for me toward the center of the room. I walked straight up the short steps and onto the slightly raised stage. Beatrice lunged forward, trying to block me, her silver evening gown shimmering under the glaring spotlight. She reached out, desperately trying to snatch the microphone from the stand to cut the audio. I was faster. Porch. Smoothly grabbing the microphone, I easily bypassed her frantically clawing hands. Good evening, everyone, I said, my voice carrying clearly over the deafening commotion of the crowd. I apologize for interrupting your lovely charity gala. My mother just gave a wonderful speech about our family legacy and her commitment to unwavering integrity. It was quite a performance. Porch. It's just a shame that everything in this room, much like that speech, is a complete fraud. Richard pushed through the crowd and shoved his way to the front, his face turning purple with rage. He ordered me to drop the microphone, threatening to have me committed to a mental institution. Ignoring him, I turned my attention to the stunning art pieces placed around the stage. Porch. Tonight, all of you are here to bid on world-class, exclusive antiques. I pointed to a massive 18th century landscape painting hanging on the east wall, then to a pair of vintage bronze sculptures flanking the entrance. My mother assured you that all proceeds from the auction of these priceless family heirlooms would be donated to charity. Beautiful pieces, really. Porch. It's just a shame that every single one of them is an absolute fake. The gallery exploded instantly. A prominent tech billionaire sitting in the front row, who had just won the landscape painting in a bidding war, furiously threw down his paddle. Beatrice gasped, clutching her chest tightly as if she had been hit hard. You're insane, she stammered, her voice shaking violently. Porch. Those are authentic works by European masters. How dare you slander my gallery like this? I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out a thick stack of neon yellow carbon receipts, holding them high so the entire room could see them clearly. These aren't certificates of authenticity, I said, walking to the edge of the stage. These are pawn shop tickets. Porch. I've spent my entire career appraising high-value estates, which means I know exactly which shadow markets to check when valuable items go missing. I looked at Beatrice coldly. 3 months ago, your precious son, Preston, ransacked the private vault of this gallery for genuine European paintings. He didn't donate them to charity. Orch. He drove across state lines to a highly secretive, illegal pawn shop because he owed $500,000 to a sports betting syndicate. I tossed the neon yellow receipts directly into the air. They fluttered down across the stage, landing right next to Beatrice's designer high heels. Orch. He pawned authentic artwork just to keep loan sharks from breaking his kneecaps, I continued, addressing the furious donors directly. Everything hanging on these walls tonight is a cheap, mass-produced replica ordered from an overseas catalog. This gala was never a charity event. It's a desperate, illegal scam to use your checkbooks to clear Preston's gambling debts. Orch. The room's reaction was immediate and explosive. The elite donors stopped whispering and began to roar. The tech billionaire rushed to the edge of the stage, demanding his deposit back instantly. Several wealthy socialites immediately called their banks on their phones, frantically canceling the checks they had written just an hour earlier. Orch. The elegant charity gala instantly devolved into an angry, chaotic mob of betrayed investors. Richard tried to perform damage control, raising his hands and begging the crowd to calm down, promising that this was all a huge misunderstanding. The damage, however, was already catastrophic. Orch. A prominent city official standing near the catering station pulled out his phone and announced loudly that he was calling the police fraud division. Amidst the deafening screams, threats of lawsuits, and the approaching wail of sirens echoing through the gallery windows, I looked past the stage toward the VIP bar. Preston had been standing there a few minutes ago, but the spot was now empty. Orch. I caught a glimpse of his custom suit jacket disappearing behind the heavy metal door of the back alley catering exit. He didn't stand up to defend his mother. He didn't stay to help his father deal with the furious investors. At the first sign of real consequences, the golden boy turned and fled into the night, abandoning his parents to face the mob and the authorities alone. Orch. I stepped off the stage without looking back. Behind me, the grand gallery in my building had completely degraded into absolute turmoil. Wealthy investors screamed at my father, demanding refunds. As the harsh red and blue flashes of police cars began to reflect through the front windows, my mother broke down, crying hysterically. I didn't stay to watch them get placed in handcuffs. Orch. My work upstairs was done. I walked through the catering exit toward the private executive elevator. The heavy steel doors slid shut, cutting off all the noise of my family's total destruction. The elevator descended smoothly to the underground VIP parking garage. The air here was cool, smelling faintly of expensive motor oil and damp concrete. Orch. My armored black SUV was parked a few yards away in a reserved space. I pressed the button on my key fob to unlock the doors, the headlights flashing twice in the dim garage. Just before my hand touched the door handle, the sharp, rapid click of designer heels against the concrete pillars echoed through the empty garage. I stopped and turned around. Orch. Simone stepped out from the shadows of a concrete pillar. My sister-in-law looked like a completely different person from the powerful woman who had stood in my office days ago, arrogantly demanding half of my building. Her flawless dark red suit jacket was unbuttoned, and she gripped her expensive leather tote bag so tightly her knuckles were pale. Orch. The untouchable persona of the real estate broker was completely shattered. In this moment, she was acting purely on survival instincts. "You didn't run with your husband," I said in a relaxed tone, leaning against my car. "I saw Preston bolt out the back alley like a scared animal. I thought you'd be right behind him." Simone let out a bitter, humorless laugh that echoed through the empty garage. Orch. I don't go down with a sinking ship, Jocelyn. I watched the police walk through that front door. Preston is a coward, and your father is a fool who thought he could outsmart the federal government. They are completely finished. She took a step closer, nervously looking around to ensure we were completely alone. I worked my fingers to the bone to build my career. Orch. As a black woman in this city, I had to fight tooth and nail to break into the elite real estate market. I married your brother because I thought I was aligning myself with an untouchable financial dynasty. I thought I was securing my status, she said through grit teeth. I refused to let a family of arrogant frauds drag me into federal prison and strip away my broker's license. Orch. I crossed my arms. I appreciate your sudden burst of honesty, Simone, but I'm not running a charity here. What do you actually want from me? Simone met my gaze with steady eyes. She reached into her designer tote bag and pulled out a small, encrypted black hard drive. Holding it between her manicured fingers, she held it in midair. I want out, she said, her voice dropping to a tense whisper. Orch. I want absolute immunity. Before the dinner upstairs completely collapsed, I accessed Richard's private server. I know you have the bank ledgers showing he drained the family trust, but this drive contains something far more valuable. It holds the precise digital routing numbers and master ledgers for your father's hidden offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Orch. It shows exactly where he hid the funds he stole from his private equity clients. I looked at the black hard drive, feeling an adrenaline surge. That ledger was the final piece of indisputable evidence needed to send my father to federal prison for a very long time. It was the ultimate fatal blow. And what's your price for this information? I asked calmly. You have federal connections now. Orch. You have high-priced lawyers and an immaculate reputation. Simone stared at me intently. When you hand this over to the authorities, I want your guarantee that my name is scrubbed entirely from the federal sweep. I want a clean exit. I hand you the final nail for your father's coffin, and you make sure I walk away without facing a single criminal charge or tax audit. Orch. I studied her face carefully. Simone was cold, calculating, and intensely self-serving. She would sell anyone out to protect herself. But that strong sense of self-preservation was precisely what made this deal reliable. She knew I had the power to crush her, so she chose to hand over her surrender. I reached out and took the black hard drive from her fingertips. Deal, Simone. Orch. Tomorrow morning, I'll have my legal team draft the immunity agreement. Keep quiet, stay out of my way, and you'll keep your real estate license. Simone let out a long breath, her posture visibly relaxing with relief. She gave a brief nod, turned, and walked toward a luxury sedan parked a few rows away. Once the immunity documents are signed, I'll send you the decryption key, she called back. Orch. I watched her walk away, a cold smile touching my face. I accepted her deal, but I was no fool. I understood exactly how Simone's mind operated. She was a master negotiator who never surrendered all her cards at once. I was entirely certain that the hard drive she just handed me contained only the tip of the data iceberg. She kept the master copy of the offshore ledgers for herself. Orch. She wasn't just looking for a clean exit, she was playing both sides. Simone fully intended to use that master copy to blackmail my father tonight, demanding a massive, untraceable sum of cash from his hidden accounts before fleeing the country, but I was always one step ahead. When I reached out to take the hard drive, I intentionally let my wrist brush against her open tote bag. Orch. In that fraction of a second, I dropped a sleek, magnetic GPS audio tracker precisely into the lining of her purse. I sat in the driver's seat of my SUV and pulled out my encrypted mobile device, opening a dedicated tracking app. A bright red dot immediately appeared on the city's digital map, tracking Simone's vehicle as it exited the parking garage and accelerated into the night. Orch. She thought she could blackmail my father and escape with millions in stolen cash. She had no idea I was listening to her every move, waiting to use her own greed to trap both of them in a federal net from which they could never escape. I watched the red dot of Simone's tracker move further away on the digital map. Orch. She was heading north, likely to clear out her private safe before the federal authorities frozen her assets completely. Closing the tracking app, I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. I needed to prepare for the inevitable fallout. I started the engine, drove out of the underground garage, and headed straight toward my primary restoration warehouse on the edge of the city. The warehouse was a massive, climate-controlled sanctuary filled with millions of dollars in precious antiques. It was my safe haven, a fortress built entirely on my own hard work. Walking through the dimly lit aisles, the rich scent of beeswax and old wood grounded me. I needed to retrieve the original paper copies of my federal certification documents from the main vault to ensure my building purchase was completely locked down before tomorrow morning. Standing beside my heavy oak workbench, I suddenly heard the unmistakable sound of shattering glass. The reinforced steel doors at the front of the warehouse were kicked open violently, the security glass panels shattering into 1,000 pieces. Heavy, erratic footsteps echoed across the concrete floor. My father stepped out of the shadows. Richard no longer looked like the high and mighty private equity director. The shoulders of his expensive tuxedo jacket were torn, his bow tie was gone, and his face was twisted into a mask of pure frantic desperation. The charity gala had clearly ended in total turmoil, and the reality of an impending federal indictment had driven him out of his mind. He strode down the central aisle, breathing heavily, his eyes bloodshot and wild. You're going to transfer the deed of that building to me right now, he roared, his voice raspy from shouting at the furious investors he had abandoned earlier. I need that $15 million to pay back the board members by tomorrow morning. You have to fix this, Jocelyn. You owe me your life. I didn't step back. Standing behind the workbench, I watched him with a steady, calculating gaze. I owe you nothing, I answered, my voice terrifyingly calm. You stole from your own clients to cover Preston's gambling debts. You dug this grave all by yourself. Richard let out an almost animalistic roar. Sweeping his arm fiercely across the nearest display table, he shattered a set of 18th century crystal decanters onto the concrete floor. They turned into powder. He was no longer trying to intimidate me with corporate threats. He was operating purely on violent rage. You ungrateful little brat, he screamed, grabbing a heavy porcelain vase from a nearby crate. I gave you a place to live. I fed you. You only exist because I allowed it. With dangerous force, he hurled the solid porcelain vase straight at my head. I ducked sharply to the left. The vase smashed against the brick wall behind me, sharp fragments flying through the air. A piece grazed my cheek, leaving a thin line of warm blood, but I didn't flinch. Evading his violence triggered a suffocating memory. This was exactly how he had handled Preston's failures while we were growing up. I remembered being 16, standing in the foyer of our house after Preston had crashed his first luxury car while driving drunk. Instead of disciplining his golden boy, Richard had backed me into a hallway corner, throwing a heavy glass paperweight at my face, screaming that I should have watched my brother, blaming me for distracting him. I had always been his physical scapegoat for the family's rage. Whenever Preston ruined something, my father smashed my belongings to vent. My entire childhood had been spent dodging shrapnel from his golden boy's mistakes, but I was no longer that terrified 16-year-old girl. I slowly reached my hand under the edge of the heavy oak workbench. My fingers found the hidden emergency panic button that was hardwired directly to the local police precinct and my building's private security team. I pressed down hard, holding it for 3 full seconds to trigger a silent emergency dispatch. You're out of time, Dad. My voice cut through the heavy silence of the warehouse. Your investors are already talking to the authorities. The fraud division is likely tearing your home office apart right now. Smashing my antiques won't save you from a federal prison sentence. Richard stepped toward me, his hands clenched into fists, preparing to climb over the workbench. He looked like a man who had completely lost everything. Before he could move, however, the sharp wail of distant sirens echoed through the quiet industrial park. The sound grew louder by the second as multiple police cruisers converged on my location from all directions. Richard froze. Porch. The sirens pierced through his violent haze, awakening the fleeing coward hidden inside him. He looked at the shattered front door, then back at me, his chest heaving violently. The image of the perfect Wall Street tycoon was dead, replaced by a desperate fugitive. He pointed a trembling, blood-stained finger at my face. Porch. I will take that building from you, Jocelyn, he growled, his voice dropping to a terrifying, raspy whisper. I will take it, even if I have to forge your signature in blood. Turning around, he sprinted down the aisle, disappearing through the shattered doorway into the dark night. Just seconds after he fled, flashing red and blue lights illuminated the front entrance of my warehouse. Porch. Driven like a man possessed, Richard sped all the way back to his sprawling suburban mansion. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles pale under the dashboard lights. He had just fled my restoration warehouse amidst the sound of sirens, leaving behind shattered porcelain and what little remained of his dignity. Porch. The reality of his collapsing Ponzi scheme had completely shattered his calm executive demeanor. Rushing through the heavy mahogany of front door, he ignored the startled house staff and went straight into his private study. He summoned my mother, Beatrice, and brother, Preston. Porch. Standing around his massive desk in sheer terror and silence, they listened as Richard laid out the brutal reality of their situation. The furious investors from the ruined charity gala had already contacted the authorities. Federal auditors would be knocking on their door by morning. Porch. Before an arrest warrant was issued, they needed immediate liquid cash to plug the massive hole in the family trust. Richard told them he had found a buyer. Porch. He had spent the entire morning desperately contacting shadow brokers, locating a private, anonymous foreign investment group willing to pay $20 million in cash for a rushed, off-market acquisition. The target being the commercial high-rise in the financial district. The very building I had purchased outright. Porch. Preston leaned against a bookshelf, his face pale with anxiety, pointing out the obvious problem. They didn't own the building. Richard sneered, sheer desperation completely overwhelming decades of legal caution. Walking over to the sofa, he picked up the leather briefcase Simone had left behind. Porch. Simone had gone upstairs to pack her bags, frantically planning her own escape, entirely unaware of what was transpiring in the study below. Richard pulled out her secure work laptop. As an elite real estate broker, Simone's hard drive had direct access to federal real estate portals and digital notarization software. Porch. Bypassing her simple password, Richard opened the official property transfer template. Beatrice walked over to the desk, a poisonous mix of greed and malice gleaming in her eyes. 5 years ago, when I was still in college, she made a habit of forging my signature on bank documents, stealing my tuition checks to transfer the funds to Preston. She knew every curve and angle of my handwriting. Porch. On the digital drawing pad, my mother forged my signature onto the massive commercial sales deed using steady, precisely calculated strokes. Richard then used Simone's registered broker credentials and her digital notary stamp to officially authenticate the forged document. Porch. They submitted the transfer agreement to the county clerk, authorizing the $20 million wire transfer request from the foreign buyer. It was a fatal, irreversible mistake. They had just committed felony identity theft, forged federal documents, and initiated a massive case of cross-border wire fraud. Porch. By the following evening, the atmosphere inside the mansion had shifted from pure panic to a state of manic euphoria. Richard stood in the middle of the grand living room, popping open a bottle of vintage champagne. Beatrice reclined on the velvet sofa, admiring her diamond ring and letting out sharp laughs as the crystal glasses were filled. Porch. Preston paced the room aggressively, constantly refreshing the banking app on his phone, already calculating how fast he could pay off his loan sharks and book a first-class ticket abroad. Richard raised his glass to propose a toast, proudly announcing that the $20 million was secured in a temporary escrow account, and would clear the federal banking system before dawn. Porch. They clinked their glasses, celebrating what they believed to be my ultimate downfall. Beatrice let out a harsh, cruel laugh that echoed off the high ceilings. She was already imagining the look on my face the next morning, when foreign investors changed the locks on my building and threw me onto the street. Porch. They felt completely untouchable, entirely oblivious to the massive legal net they had just locked around themselves. A few miles away, I sat quietly in my penthouse office. The city lights poured in through the floor-to-sizzling windows, casting long shadows across the mahogany desk. The building was dead silent. My encrypted phone rested on the polished wood. Porch. At exactly 9 in the evening, the screen lit up with a high-priority alert. On the day I finalized the property purchase, I had set up an automated, high-security title monitoring protocol with the county clerk. I picked up the phone and opened the notification. It was an official alert indicating a pending title transfer and a submitted deed of sale for my commercial building. Porch. I downloaded the attached digital file, staring at my forged signature, which had been boldly notarized using Simone's broker license number. I saw the buyer listed as an anonymous international investment firm, with the sale price recorded at exactly $20 million. I didn't gasp, I didn't panic. A slow, predatory smile spread across my face. Porch. Any normal property owner seeing this would immediately call their real estate lawyer to halt the fraudulent sale and freeze the title. But I wasn't a normal property owner, and I had no intention of stopping the transaction. I was going to let them complete the crime entirely. I was going to let them transmit forged documents across state and international borders. I picked up my encrypted phone. Porch. Instead of calling a lawyer, I dialed a direct, unlisted number given to me by a senior investigator in the Federal Financial Crimes Division. The line rang twice before connecting. Porch. In a completely calm voice, I informed the federal agent that I was reporting a massive case of felony wire fraud and identity theft, and that the perpetrators had just transmitted indisputable digital evidence directly into the government's hands. I stayed on the line with Agent Thompson, the senior investigator from the Federal Financial Crimes Division. Porch. I didn't raise my voice, but the gravity of the situation was crystal clear. I told him an illegal multi-million-dollar property transfer across state lines had just been initiated, and I possessed the digital receipts to prove it. Within 45 minutes, I walked through the heavy, bulletproof glass doors of the federal field office in downtown Boston. Porch. Agent Thompson, a stern, unsmiling man, met me in a sparsely furnished, brightly lit interrogation room. I placed my encrypted phone and a thick stack of printed digital logs onto the cold metal table. Agent Thompson carefully reviewed the urgent notification from the county clerk. Porch. He noted the forged signature, the shocking $20 million price tag, and the buyer listed simply as an anonymous international investment firm. Looking up, he reached for his desk phone, asking if I needed his cyber team to freeze the transaction immediately to prevent my property from being officially transferred. Porch. I leaned across the metal table, looked him dead in the eye, and told him, absolutely not. I wanted the transaction completed fully. Agent Thompson looked puzzled, warning me that allowing the deed to clear meant legally handing my $15 million asset to a shadow shell company. I didn't argue. Porch. Instead, I reached into my purse, pulled out a separate, federally certified corporate registration document, and slid it across the table until it rested right beside the forged deed. I told him I didn't need the federal government to save my building from foreign investors. Because I am the foreign investor. Agent Thompson stared at the corporate registration document. Porch. His eyes widened instantly as he read the name of the managing director of this international investment firm. It was my name. Leaning back in the metal chair, I explained the trap. Months ago, when I transferred the initial restoration funds from London, I used a well-connected Swiss banking contact to establish an offshore shell company in the Cayman Islands. Porch. I knew my father, Richard, was a desperate cornered animal. I knew he urgently needed untraceable liquid capital to cover his collapsing Ponzi scheme before authorities caught up with him. From the moment he realized he couldn't legally take my building through a medical conservatorship, I knew he would try to sell it behind my back. So I had my offshore financial contacts quietly spread a targeted rumor through the shadow real estate market. A deep-pocketed anonymous buyer was looking for an off-market commercial high-rise in Boston's financial district, willing to offer $20 million in clean, immediate cash. Richard swallowed the bait whole, completely blinded by pure greed and escalating panic. My family had attempted to sell my building to a stranger, entirely unaware that they were actually selling it right back to me. By forging my signature on that deed and using a digital notary to authenticate it, Richard, Beatrice, and Preston had crossed the point of no return. But by transmitting that forged deed to a foreign entity and requesting a $20 million wire transfer across international borders, they had elevated a local real estate dispute into a massive federal case involving wire fraud, international identity theft, and corporate money laundering. They had perfectly packaged their own federal indictments and delivered them straight into a government sting operation. The $20 million sitting in their temporary escrow account wasn't a lifeline saving them from destruction. It was a tracking beacon placed there by federal authorities to monitor their every move. While I was finalizing the complete destruction of my family in the federal conference room, real chaos was quietly unfolding back at the suburban mansion. Simone had been locked in the guest room for 2 hours, frantically packing her designer luggage. As a successful real estate broker, she had fought hard to climb to the top of a ruthless industry. She refused to let her husband's gambling addiction and her father-in-law's financial crimes ruin the career she had built. Her plan was to slip out the back door, wire her personal assets to an offshore account, and disappear completely before federal audits began at dawn. Simone reached for her secure work laptop, the very device Richard had used earlier in the study. She opened the screen, intending to wipe all local data from the hard drive. As the monitor lit up, she noticed a background application still running in the taskbar. It was her digital notarization software. Frowning, Simone moved her fingers quickly across the trackpad. She hadn't notarized any documents in days. Opening the transaction history log, her breath caught in her throat. There, time-stamped just 2 hours prior, was a completed $20 million commercial property transfer record. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Simone opened the digital deed. Staring at the forged signature, she immediately recognized Beatrice's handwriting style. What made her blood run cold, however, was the authorization box at the bottom of the page. It prominently displayed her personal real estate broker license number and her federally registered digital notary stamp. Preston and Richard hadn't just forged documents to steal my building. They had used her encrypted credentials to commit the crime. The brutal reality hit Simone like a suffocating wave. She knew federal authorities were already investigating Apex Financial. When the government inevitably traced this fraudulent $20 million transaction, the digital trail wouldn't point to Richard or Preston. The IP address, the broker's license, and the notary stamp pointed exclusively to her. Her husband and father-in-law had intentionally set her up to take the fall for their federal financial crimes. They planned to flee with the $20 million, leaving her behind to face charges of felony wire fraud. Simone slammed the laptop shut. The calculating, composed mask melted away entirely, replaced by the scorching rage of a deeply betrayed woman. She didn't cry. She didn't panic. Unzipping her travel bag, she reached past her carefully packed clothes, reaching into the very bottom lining. She was no longer just trying to escape this sinking ship. She was going to burn it down, and she was going to make sure her husband drowned first. I sat in the passenger seat of Agent Thompson's unmarked federal surveillance vehicle, parked discreetly in the shadows at the end of my parents' tree-lined suburban street. The glowing dashboard monitor illuminated the dark interior. Through the encrypted audio receiver in my hand, I listened to the crystal-clear transmission, coming from the magnetic bug I had dropped into Simone's purse earlier that evening. The audio feed was flawless. I could hear my sister-in-law's heavy, frantic breathing as her heels pressed into the carpeted hallway of the mansion. Then, I heard a heavy wooden door shoved open violently. She had caught my brother. Preston was celebrating loudly in the billiards room. I could hear the distinct clinking of crystal glasses and sickeningly cheerful jazz playing in the background. He was likely toasting his sudden wealth, completely unaware that federal crosshairs were locked onto his position. What the hell is wrong with you, Simone? Preston slurred, his voice thick with the smell of expensive bourbon. You look like you've seen a ghost. Grab a glass. We've got $20 million now. We're untouchable. You framed me, Simone screamed, her voice raspy with absolute fury. I checked the digital logs on my work laptop. You and your father used my registered credentials and notary stamp without my consent to authenticate that forged deed. When the authorities investigate this transaction, every single lead will point straight to my license. You set me up to take the fall for your wire fraud. Preston burst out laughing, a cold, arrogant sound that dismissed her completely. Even sitting in the surveillance vehicle, the sound made my blood boil. So what if we did? Preston sneered, his tone dripping with condescension. You married into this family for our status and our money, Simone. Did you really think you were an equal partner? You're just a glorified real estate agent we brought along for the ride. Someone has to take the hit if things go south, and it's certainly not going to be me or my father. Be a good wife, sit down, and keep your mouth shut. The arrogance was staggering. Even facing total destruction, my brother still believed he was a superior being who could use anyone as a shield for his failures. Through the audio feed, I heard the sharp, metallic click of a purse zipper, followed by a sudden, heavy silence in the billiards room. What is that? Preston's voice suddenly lost its slurred bravado, cracking with genuine fear. Simone, put that down. Are you insane? I clawed my way up from nothing, Simone said, her voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly whisper. I earned every single thing I have. I will not lose my freedom for a pathetic, gambling-addicted thief who can't even stand on his own 2 feet. A loud scuffle echoed through the speakers, followed by the heavy thud of furniture being overturned and a sharp cry of pain from Preston. Agent Thompson immediately turned to me, his hand on the door handle. We're moving in now. Execute the warrants, I said, my voice steady and cold. 4 black tactical vans surged out of the shadows, their sirens wailing as they tore up the long driveway of the mansion. Blinding spotlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the grand facade of the house. Federal agents in tactical gear breached the heavy mahogany front doors, their shouts echoing through the sprawling estate. I stepped out of the surveillance car and walked slowly up the driveway, watching the final act of my family's collapse. Inside the grand foyer, total chaos reigned. Richard was pinned to the marble floor near his study, handcuffed behind his back as federal agents secured the server racks containing evidence of his massive Ponzi scheme. He was screaming about his corporate connections, but no one was listening. Beatrice was collapsed on the velvet sofa, sobbing hysterically as agents bagged her forged financial documents into evidence. Her pristine, high society life was completely ruined. In the billiards room, Preston was on his knees, his face pale and bruised, his hands cuffed behind him. Beside him, Simone stood silently, her hands also secured in plastic zip ties, but her head was held high. She looked at Preston with pure contempt as he wept like a child, begging the officers for mercy. As the agents led my family out of the mansion in handcuffs, Richard caught sight of me standing near the entrance. his face contorted in pure rage. "Orch, you did this!" he screamed, his voice echoing across the manicured lawn. "You destroyed your own family! You're a monster, Jocelyn!" I walked up to him, stopping just inches away from where he stood in handcuffs. "I didn't destroy this family, Dad," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the crisp night air. "Orch, you destroyed it the day you decided that people only matter if they can be used, bought, or discarded. You threw away Grandma's treasures, you protected a thief, and you tried to erase my existence. I simply let you face the true cost of your choices." I looked at Richard, Beatrice, and Preston one last time as they were loaded into the back of the federal transport vans. Orch. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the grand mansion, a fitting backdrop for the end of their illusion. They had spent their lives treating me as an embarrassing disappointment, believing their wealth and status made them untouchable. In the end, they had destroyed themselves, leaving me standing alone in the light, the sole owner of my life, my business, and my future. "Orch, you need to relax," Preston sneered. "Nobody is going to investigate anything. The buyer is an anonymous international group. The funds will settle in a few hours, and then we wipe the hard drive. Besides, you owe this family. We elevated you. You get to play high-end luxury broker because your name carries my last name. Orch, if we need to borrow your pathetic notary stamp to save the family trust, you should view it as the cost of doing business. You're my wife. If I need you to take the fall, you take it." The audio feed went completely dead silent. It was a suffocating stillness, a woman finally realizing that the man she married viewed her as nothing more than a disposable corporate shield. Orch. As a Black woman, Simone had fought relentlessly in a highly competitive, exclusionary real estate market to build an untouchable reputation. She had married Preston believing they were a power couple. Hearing him dismiss her entire career as a mere byproduct of his family name, while openly planning to send her to federal prison in his place, was the ultimate betrayal. Orch. That doesn't sound like a woman planning to quietly take the fall. Agent Thompson commented softly from the driver's seat, listening to the same audio feed. "She won't," I replied, my eyes locked on the massive mansion at the end of the street. "She's going to empty his pockets right now." Through the receiver, I heard Simone draw a slow, terrifyingly calm breath. "Orch. You're right, Preston," she said, all the rage suddenly vanishing from her voice. "I overreacted. I'm going upstairs to pour myself a drink. Enjoy your celebration." I heard the distinct click of her high heels as she turned and walked out of the billiards room. But she didn't go upstairs. I listened carefully to the steady rhythm of her footsteps against the hardwood floors. Orch. She was moving toward the east wing of the house, heading straight for Richard's private study. I looked at Agent Thompson and gave a slight nod. "It's time." I pushed the car door open and stepped into the brisk early winter night air. Armed federal tactical agents were already moving like shadows across the manicured lawn, securing the perimeter of the entire estate. Orch. I walked up the paved driveway directly toward the grand mahogany front door. I didn't need to break in. My parents had been so confident in my complete defeat that they hadn't even bothered to change the digital entry code. The same code I had used when living here as a teenager. I pressed the 6-digit sequence. The heavy lock gave a soft mechanical hum and clicked open. Orch. I stepped into the grand foyer of my childhood home, the very place where I had been treated as an outcast for 33 years. Moving silently down the hallway, I followed the faint glow of a computer monitor spilling through the cracked door of my father's study. I stopped outside, perfectly concealed in the shadows. Inside, Simone sat behind Richard's massive executive desk. Orch. Her hands flew across the keyboard with rapid, frantic precision. Using credentials she had likely stolen from Preston months ago, she was logged into the master administrative portal for Apex Financial. On the large desktop monitor, the $20 million rested neatly in the temporary escrow account. Simone showed no panic. She was executing a flawless, vengeful financial strike. Orch. She opened a second tab, setting the transfer coordinates to a highly secretive private offshore account in the Bahamas. She intended to drain the entire escrow fund, take the $20 million my family thought they had stolen from me, and flee the country before sunrise. She was going to leave Preston and Richard completely broke and fully accountable for the forged deed. Orch. She typed in the final authorization code. Taking a deep breath, her finger hovered over the mouse. She clicked submit. The loading icon spun in the center of the screen for 3 agonizing seconds. Simone leaned closer, a triumphant smile beginning to form at the corner of her lips. Then the entire screen flashed a harsh, blinding crimson. Orch. A massive security banner locked the computer system down. In bold, unyielding white letters it read, Transaction Ribbit. Account size by federal authorities. Simone gasped, her body recoiling sharply from the desk. She slammed her hands onto the keyboard, trying to force a system refresh, but the controls were completely frozen. Orch. The entire banking portal had been hijacked by the government's sting operation. The $20 million she thought she was stealing was locked inside an impenetrable federal vault. Her escape plan was completely shattered. The brutal reality crashed down on her. She had no money, no leverage, and that forged deed was still legally tied directly to her name. Orch. I stepped out from the shadows into the soft light of the study. Simone spun around, her dark eyes widening in pure terror when she saw me standing there. You should have taken my deal, Simone, I said coldly, my voice echoing in the quiet room. Now you're gonna fall right along with them. I left Simone trembling in my father's dimly lit study. Orch. My sister-in-law was completely paralyzed by the trap she had walked into, backed into a corner of her own making. If she walked out to warn Richard and Beatrice that the $20 million was locked in a federal sting, she would have to admit she just tried to take the money for herself, abandoning her husband and his family to face federal prosecution alone. Orch. So she did the only thing a self-serving coward could do. She closed the laptop, kept her mouth shut, and waited silently for total destruction to arrive. The following afternoon was Thanksgiving. For most normal families, it was a day of gratitude and quiet reflection. But for my parents, it was simply a strategic opportunity for aggressive public relations. Orch. Richard and Beatrice were entirely oblivious to the federal asset seizure. They truly believed the fraudulent sale of my building had been a flawless, undetected success. Because it was a federal holiday, Richard assumed the massive wire transfer was simply queued in international banking channels and would formally post to his account by morning. Orch. To celebrate their perceived victory, and to quickly silence the terrifying rumors about Richard's drained trust vaults following the ruined charity gala, my parents decided to host the most lavish Thanksgiving dinner our wealthy suburban community had ever seen. I spent Thanksgiving morning at the federal field office, verifying the final digital paper trail with Agent Thompson. Orch. By the time I left the government building, the arrest warrants had been formally signed by a federal judge. The authorities were simply waiting for sunset to execute the raid. I returned to my penthouse, showered, and prepared for the final act of this decades-long family dynamic. I recalled every past Thanksgiving dinner I had endured in that house. Orch. I remembered being forced to sit at the far end of the table, listening to Beatrice make passive-aggressive remarks about my weight, my single status, and my appraisal career that they viewed as trash. I remembered watching Preston enjoy the finest cuts of meat, while my father praised his mediocre performance at the firm. Orch. I had spent 33 years swallowing my pride just to keep the peace in that house. Now I wasn't swallowing anything ever again. I didn't dress like the evicted, defeated daughter they expected. I put on a stunning, flawlessly tailored charcoal gray designer suit, paired with a crisp white silk blouse, minimalist gold jewelry, and sharp stiletto heels. Orch. I looked like a completely successful independent woman who owned a $15 million commercial high-rise outright. As night fell, the autumn sky turned a deep, heavy shade of purple. I drove my armored SUV along the winding suburban roads, parking directly behind my father's luxury sedan in the circular driveway. The estate was buzzing with valet attendants and catering staff. Porch. The guest list was a strategic directory of Boston's elite, prominent politicians, wealthy socialites, and the very private equity investors Richard had been stealing from for years. My parents wanted to look their victims in the eye, projecting an image of absolute, untouchable wealth. I walked right past the valet stand. I didn't knock on the heavy mahogany door. Porch. Using the front door entry code one last time, the lock clicked open, and I pushed my way inside. The mansion was filled with a deafening hum of dozens of overlapping conversations, the sharp clinking of fine crystal, and cheerful classical music playing through the sound system. Waiters in black ties carried trays of expensive hors d'oeuvres through the crowded foyer. Porch. Stepping into the hall, my heels clicked sharply against the polished marble floor. I saw Preston holding court in the center of the grand living room, laughing loudly as he handed out expensive imported cigars to a group of real estate developers. He truly believed his massive gambling debts were officially cleared. Simone, however, was a different story. Porch. My sister-in-law stood silently near the massive stone fireplace, completely isolating herself from the crowd. She gripped a glass of ice water so tightly her knuckles were chalk white. She looked physically ill. She knew every single person in the room was standing on a federal landmine, and she was simply counting down the seconds to detonation. Porch. Avoiding all eye contact with my mother and ignoring her husband, she stared blankly ahead, waiting for the authorities to breach the doors. As I walked deeper into the living room, the sound of my footsteps cut through the ambient background noise. One by one, the wealthy guests turned to look at me. The chatter began to quiet down in a rapid, cascading wave. Porch. Within 30 seconds, the massive, crowded room fell into a complete, deeply unsettling silence. Boston high society knew exactly who I was. They had read the vicious magazine article published by my